How's it going, everybody, and welcome to episode 162 of Master My Garden podcast. Now, this week's episode, we're going stateside again, and an exciting interview, looking forward to it. And I'm talking to Andrew Bunting, who's the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society Vice President of Horticulture. For the rest of the podcast, I mightn't use all of that terminology, and we'll refer to the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society as PHS, just for easiness sake. But what we're going to talk about is a survey that PHS has done on gardening trends for 2023, and it'll be interesting to see, are the trends that we're seeing here on this side of the Atlantic quite similar to what Andrew and his team are seeing over there. So firstly, Andrew, you're very, very welcome to Master My Garden podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I know it's afternoon there already. It's just the start of the day here, so appreciate you having me on.
No problem. Delighted to have you on, and yeah, you'll be nice and fresh first thing in the morning there. So
yes.
Yeah, so I suppose, that's what we're going to center the episode on. And we'll, as I said before we started recording, we'll go wherever the conversation goes. And I know you've written your own book on magnolias, and we might chat about that a little bit. But before we get into the trends, which is going to be the main topic of the conversation, just tell us a little bit about yourself and your gardening history and PHS.
Sure. So my entire career I've spent in kind of the public garden sector. So I've been at the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society about a little over 3 years. And prior to that, I worked at Chicago Botanic Garden for a long time. Over 25 years, I was the curator at the Scott Arboretum at Swarthmore College, which is actually right here in the town where I live. And then early on in my career, I worked at Chanticleer, which is an internationally famous garden nearby. Today, nowadays at PHS, I'm really involved in kind of all aspects of the organization. I do a lot of kind of developing of content like podcasts, and I write a lot of articles. I do a lot of lecturing. I also do quite a bit of traveling, trying to get to trade shows and visit other gardens and, try to get a broader sense of what's happening in horticulture today so that I can kind of either bring it back and share it with our public gardening staff or share it with our PR team, our communications team. Some of it gets then articulated into the Philadelphia Flower Show, which is the longest running flower show in the world, as well as the biggest indoor flower show in the world. And it's been going since 1829,
Wow.
Almost every single year. And so that's a big event. It's like, Chelsea or Hampton Court Show, kind of of that magnitude. For us, it happens kind of at the end of winter, beginning of spring in March. We have exhibitors that are hyper local and some that are from around the world. We have a florist coming from Singapore, but then we also have one of our major exhibitors is from Germantown, which is a part of Philadelphia. And through all of our work, PHS really works to advance 4 impact priorities, which are creating healthy living environments, increasing access to fresh food, expanding economic opportunity, whether that's new jobs or entrepreneurship, and then building meaningful social connections. We really feel that horticulture is the gateway to so many different types of social connections, and just bringing people together regardless of their ethnicity, their socioeconomic background, or whatever the case might be. So we really feel it is like a great conduit.
Yeah, it's funny. Horticulture, it's different in some ways around the world, but it's very similar in a lot of ways as well. And you talk about friendships and relationships and the people within them and the people within horticulture. I've yet to find people in horticulture, and this might sound a little bit odd, but I've yet to find people in horticulture who are not what we call here in Ireland sound people and nice people. It tends to have, I don't know, I guess it's the connection that people have with the earth and so on, that it brings that sort of a person, but you don't really find, people who are not nice, for want of a better word,
Yeah.
in the industry.
Yeah, I think it's a great equalizer. Like I've, served on boards and met horticulturists who are, incredibly wealthy. And I've worked with people that have, virtually no money. And, it's kind of the same, it just kind of levels the playing field, regardless of where you are. And I travel the world, and the same is true everywhere I go.
Yeah, it's true. So the trends for 2023, which we're going to get into, like there's trends that we see on this side, and I think it's going to be interesting, and I suspect we're going to see a little bit of overlap, although maybe not everything will overlap. So tell us about this survey, the initiation of it, and sort of the results that you've come to. And
Yeah, so over the course of a year, mainly me, I'm kind of pulling in information, and this again has a lot to do with what I'm observing, either in the garden. I do a lot of visiting of gardens, both regionally, nationally, and internationally, and also try to go to, I can't go to every garden show on the planet, but every year I go to some. Like last year I went to Hampton Court, and I went to Floriade in the Netherlands, and I do a bunch of visit a lot of trade shows in the United States. So I'm kind of pulling all that information together, and just looking for kind of the common trends. And for us, I would say, and I'm sure this is true, in Ireland and England and Europe, the rest of Europe for sure, is what we're seeing is, and this is just has been ongoing, and it's probably been ongoing for at least 15 years, but has really been ratcheted up lately, is the homeowner's interest in gardening to really have ecological impact.
Mm-hmm.
And we're really seeing that in a number of ways. Like here, people understand plants that provide pollination functions, and they understand what pollinators are, at a fairly basic level. Yeah. We have the monarch butterfly, which is endangered. That's been listed this year. So a lot of people are planting plants specifically for that. One in particular is one of our native milkweeds, Asclepias tuberosa, but there's other milkweeds and other plants that will support that butterfly in particular. But the fact that there's a butterfly that people, most people, if you showed them a picture of a monarch butterfly, they probably could tell you what it is.
Yeah.
So you're seeing a lot of people, converting either part of their existing garden to maybe a part of the garden that's more habitat focused, maybe more pollinator focused, maybe some shrubs and other plants for local birds and migrating birds, or there's kind of trends within trends. One of the trends within this trend is for people just to consider converting 10% of their great American lawn to a garden, or more garden space. And for anybody, all that would have to would be to just extend the edge of the bed out by a foot or so. So you don't have to give up your lawn, but that is a trend. And another kind of trend within the ecological trend is there is a movement called Leave the Leaves. And so, for example, one of our biggest public parks in the United States is Brooklyn Bridge Park. It's very public, has great gardens, very interactive, but it also supports a lot of ecology in the middle of New York City. And one of the things that they're advocating for is, at the end of the season, and typically here in the United States, you either bag up your leaves and put them out on the curb. Luckily in Swarthmore, you can push them to the curb and they suck them up and compost them elsewhere. Some people might compost them on site, but the leave the leaves movement is either just leave the leaves in the bed as a mulch from the fall over the winter going into the spring. Some people might feel like that aesthetic is too rough. So kind of an intermediate intervention would be to push them out, mow over them, cut them into smaller sizes, and then remulch your beds with that, and then let those leaves decompose over the winter and turn into leaf compost, and then soil in the spring. So I would say that's kind of just gaining a little traction. A lot of people still like a certain aesthetic, and that's probably the hardest thing to change. Is there's, when I travel throughout, the UK, Ireland, that your aesthetic is different overall than our aesthetic. Ours is can be a bit more sterile in that it's typically a house, some shrubs across the front of the house, a lawn in the front, and then the sidewalk or the street.
Yeah.
So, that aesthetic is, been ingrained in people's minds for generations. So, a lot of this is creating really kind of a shift in kind of the gardening paradigm. And there was it was on CNN. There was this couple in Maryland, and they lived in we have these things called HOAs, homeowners associations, where it might be, like a big development, and then they have some sort of governing body, and they turned their entire front yard into a meadow, and the neighbors, flipped out because it was not, their typical landscape that they've been used to, and they fought it, and I think they won. But that made national news, and that was great, because then it showed people that there are alternatives to the way we have gardened for so long.
It's a funny thing, actually, isn't it? Because we're slightly different here in a way, but there still is the same thing where, okay, our lawns typically at the fronts are not as big, generally speaking, especially in our towns and our suburbs. They're not as big as that, as the typical big house with big lawn to the front that we see on your side of the Atlantic. But it's a funny thing in that if everybody's lawn at the front or garden here at the front is in grass, the first person to make that move will be ridiculed because it looks odd and it's not in sequence with everybody else. It's a bit like when the hanging baskets go out here in the summertime. As soon as one person puts them up, everybody puts them up. So it's all copy.
Yeah.
And when one person does the floral meadow or the native meadow at the front, initially it can look odd and not as neat and tidy, and you do get that little bit of resistance. But if they can spread to 2 people on the street or 3, it might start to become a domino effect where eventually that becomes the norm as opposed to the lawn. But it is at this point in time, and we're definitely seeing that in trends here. At this point in time, there is almost like a war or a little bit of I suppose, a grating together of the natural and the manicured, and that's kind of happening at the moment here for sure.
Yeah, there's definitely factions, here, the native people, can be, it's kind of all natives or nothing. I'm more of the mindset, and a lot of the work that we do is in very urban areas in Philadelphia. So I'm really more an advocate for, urban tough plants that are resilient. Sometimes they're native, sometimes they're not. We probably lean a little bit more towards native plants, but that's not the only plants that we use. We're also looking at, which kind of ties into the ecological functions, is with global climate change, we're having such erratic weather patterns, and part of that is hotter summers and then more extended periods of drought. We always have summers where we might have, 2 or 3 weeks with no rain, but now we're starting to have even hotter summers, which kind of exacerbates the drought. And then, periods where it might be 4 to 6 weeks without rain. So the need to grow or use plants that are more drought tolerant, and even, I know it's hard to really kind of extrapolate all the aspects of global climate change, but even in the last 30 years, I've seen certain trees that used to thrive, they just struggle. Certain conifers don't do as well as they used to. A good example is the blue Atlas cedar. That used to be more of a fairly common conifer, and now it's kind of rarely used. And the ones that are big are suffering, and it's hard to say what it is. It could be, it could be the heat for sure. It could be the humidity as well. Could be these massive inundation of water that we have, because we get, while we typically wouldn't get a hurricane here in Philadelphia, what we get are kind of the tail ends of hurricanes. So say a hurricane comes up through Louisiana, by the time it moves across the country and gets to Philadelphia, it may still dump, 10 to 15 inches of rain, over like a 24-hour period. And kind of that mass inundation of water, I think, is having an adverse impact on plants. But getting back to kind of the water-wise plants, that's where we, a lot of the ones we are promoting are prairie natives, things that would have grown in the Midwestern prairies, because they have very long tap roots. Things like a lot of the grasses like switchgrass, panicum, little blue stem, Schizocarium scoparium, threadleaf blue star is a great perennial, Amsonia, Baptisias, Vernonias. All of those have proven to be pretty drought tolerant for the most part.
Yeah, it's interesting what you said about trees, because right, we don't get the extremes either in heat or in cold that you guys would get. But what we are seeing sort of regularly enough is longer cold snaps in the springtime, but in the summertime or late spring, early summer, we're seeing these extended drought periods. And drought for us, I'm conscious of saying drought, because I know for you guys, you mightn't even consider what we have at times a drought. But what we are seeing is that you're getting this spell. At the very start of the first COVID lockdowns in 2020, we got a really long spell of dry weather, and that was followed the following year by a long period as well, but it was at a different time. And generally the big trees that we had here, the native trees, horse chestnuts particularly, I see struggling with it. And year one, they seem to be fine. Year two, you could definitely see, a little bit of a weakening, or the coloring just wasn't what it should be during that drought period. And then when we got the third year in a row of a drought, again at a different period in the year, a lot of these fully mature trees died. So I think it was like the knock-on effect of the 3 years, because occasionally you might get 1 year, if you went back 20 years ago, you might get 1 year that had this long period of weather, but then it would be back to our typical wet summer. But at the moment, we seem to be getting a spell every year. And it seems to be that knock-on effect is definitely affecting, well, a lot of plants, but particularly our big trees are noticeably suffering at times.
Yeah, I agree. It's like for us, kind of the same thing. It used to be fairly patterned weather with little blips here and there, and now it's lots of blips during the year. Like we, probably for the last 10 or 15 years have had increasingly milder winters, but then we had one of the coldest winters we've had in the last 15 years. This I mean, just for a period of time, but enough to damage those things that have been unscathed for the last 15 years or so. It got cold all the way down into like the middle of Florida, and snowed, and I think I saw snow at least snowflakes and somewhere in Florida on the beach. So, it's that, but then it's like, these epic tornadoes and rain events, and then the heat and dryness of this summer, and that's, likely only to increase. So we're trying, I think this water wise movement, which also kind of, another thing that's kind of a sub trend under that, and it's percolating. People are starting to do it, is the use of gravel gardens. So I did a gravel garden in my front yard, which is essentially kind of excavating out like 4 inches of soil, putting in like a granite gravel, and then kind of planting plants that kind of grow through the gravel almost hydroponically and anchor in the soil below. And once they're anchored and established, it's kind of multifold. One, they don't really require much water, because when it does rain, and all the rain kind of goes right through the gravel to the roots below. And because you have this essentially 4 inches of gravel on top, is almost like a mulch, it's so hot and dry there that weeds don't establish themselves. The only things that establish themselves are things that you would probably want, like poppies or maybe some euphorbias that might seed around. So it's for some people, it's maybe too of a modern aesthetic. But it is, we, like the Scott Arboretum where I used to work, they've done quite a bit with kind of gravel garden technology. I think that you see a fair amount of it in Germany. Actually, the godmother of gravel gardening is probably Beth Chatto. She had they're still there in kind of southeastern England. So Chanticleer has a big gravel garden. Jeff Epping, who's in Madison, Wisconsin, he's known in the US anyways as the gravel guru. So that's I'd say gradually trending. It's maybe too much for a lot of homeowners to take on, but I think you'll start to see it in more public installations.
Yeah, there's not that many here in Ireland, but there is a couple of, and you mentioned a couple of years ago you were here in November, I think you said, and you called it Jimmy Blake's garden. Now Jimmy has an area which is a gravel garden in effect, and he has been growing lots of cacti outdoors in Ireland on granite stone, which is where he is as well, because they would get quite a bit of frost and so on up there. So he's done really well. Obviously they come in the winter time, but he's done really well to get that going up there. And then there's a very good garden designer in Kilkenny called Des Dial, and he has a gravel garden, but they're not commonplace here, I don't think, yet, and certainly not in public spaces. It seems to be very, very much a new trend possibly here.
Yeah, it's also an opportunity with gravel gardening, opportunity to grow kind of a new palette of plants. You mentioned cactus. There's quite a few, especially in the western states in the United States, native cactus, and normally they wouldn't grow here because it would be too hot, humid, and our soils aren't well drained enough. But in a gravel garden, they all do pretty well. It's not so much a matter of hardiness with us, it's a matter of humidity and having a well-drained soil.
Yeah. So continuing on the garden trends then, I saw on your list houseplants. So houseplants for me don't do it for me at all. I've absolutely no interest in them, but I know over the last couple of years, certainly, well, particularly since COVID, but prior to that even, houseplants were growing massively in popularity. Are you seeing that still, that growth continuing?
Yeah, I definitely, like, I used to go to a lot of these trade shows, and there wouldn't be any purveyors or nurseries offering house plants, and now there's a lot. It's not just the house plants. There's this whole kind of paralleling trend for home decor. So it's like monsteras and philodendrons and a lot of different kind of aroids, plants with heart-shaped leaves. And then there's, accessories that go along with those, with pots and so forth. And there's a woman in the United States, her name is Summer Rain Oakes, and I met her probably 6 years ago, maybe 7 years ago, and she was just getting into, I mean, she always had houseplants in her apartment in Brooklyn. And then she kind of started retooling her career and really started promoting houseplants, doing videos on them. And I just looked at her YouTube channel last night, and she has 520,000 subscribers on YouTube. So, and she's just one of hundreds of what I would consider kind of houseplant influencers. And, you know, what's interesting about houseplants is, you know, people have been growing them for years. I'm kind of like you. I have a couple here and there, but it's more things that I'm overwintering from the garden versus houseplants. But it is kind of an entryway into gardening for people that maybe live in an apartment building and don't have any real access to outdoor space. So, you know, if that's the case, and like Summer Rain in her apartment in Brooklyn, she had hundreds of houseplants. She's now moved to a farm up in upstate New York, but yeah, you know, it's fairly easy. We do these at the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society. We do plant swaps at a couple of our gardens, and those are hugely popular. You know, people bring in just cuttings of like jade plant or pothos or spider plants. Some people bring in little bags of soil, some people bring in pots, and they just kind of freely exchange plants. And for a lot of the people, it is their first time to grow some of these things. And, you know, some house plants are very easy. So I think that's also appealing to a lot of people. But a lot of these companies also, like one of our biggest brands, plant brands in the United States is Proven Winners. And at two recent trade shows, I noticed they now have a whole line of new introductions of things like Ficus benjamino, which is a super common house plant. So not only are the house plants growing in interest, but a lot of these big companies that do plant breeding are also breeding and selecting kind of new iterations or new versions of, you know, things that, you know, were fairly common, like Sansevieria, the mother-in-law's tongue. You know, there was just one. Now there's dozens of them available.
No, houseplants and trends in houseplants, and as you said, houseplant accessories. The trend has been massive over the last few years. I go to some of the horticultural trade shows in Europe, and yeah, that's one of the trends that you would definitely see. Houseplant and houseplant accessories, there just seems to be more and more, and more dedicated space to them every year. So it's definitely growing. It's just a brilliant name. You said it's Summer Rain Oaks. What a brilliant name for somebody working in gardening.
The second name is Rayne, but you know,
from a sound perspective, it's a brilliant name.
No, it's her real name.
It's class. You just go back to a second. So you released a book in 2015, all about magnolias, the Plant Lover's Guide to Magnolias. Tell us a little bit about that.
Sure.
Still in publication.
As I mentioned before, I worked at the Scott Arboretum at Swarthmore College as the curator there for over 20 years. And they have a large magnolia collection. And in my time there, we expanded it greatly. And I think through that work, I was asked to join the board of the Magnolia Society International, which is an international plant society. I would say probably there's more members in the US than any other country, but there's a lot in the UK. And actually the third most are in Sweden. Like, you know, southern Sweden is warmer than most people would think. Everybody, at least in the United States, if you say Sweden, they think of like people, you know, dressed in big coats and snow all the time. So in any case, I got invited to the board, and then I just became more involved in magnolias just through those associations. So I got asked to write some articles, and it was actually, I wrote an article for a magazine that's the magazine of the American Horticultural Society called American Gardener on magnolias. And then the editor from Timber Farm said, would you want to expand upon that and write a book? So that's kind of how that came to be. And the book it's this kind of part of this Plant Lovers Guide series. It's about 150 pages. I think there's like 130 different magnolias. So it's not there are other books that have been written on magnolias that are more like the encyclopedia of all the magnolias. This is it was meant to be global, so that somebody in Ireland or Australia or New Zealand or Budapest or wherever could pick it up and find a handful of magnolias that would do well in their region. Same with the United States. We have some parts of the US that are extremely cold, like the upper Midwest, but then we have obviously areas that are tropical, like southern Florida and southern California. So there's also magnolias in the book that are good for those parts of the country.
Nice one. And still in publication.
Still in publication. I think you can still get it, of course, on Amazon.
Yeah.
I don't know if you can get it from Timber Press anymore. I know that there was a limited printing, but I know there's some still kicking around.
Very good. And you're not working on anything else book-wise, are you?
No, like everybody, I've thought about my home garden. I know there's lots of people have written books on their home gardens. Not sure if, I have gone through many trials and tribulations, so that may be just like an expanded article for somebody.
Just to take a step back, I know there's one trend that's on the list that we haven't covered. But before we get to that, just to go back to the Pennsylvania Flower Show again. So the longest running flower show in the world. Just because I'm not familiar with the show, as in I've heard of it, but I'm not familiar with it. I've never been to it. I'm not familiar with how it works, what elements are within it. So just tell us a little bit more about that, maybe.
Yeah. So there's kind of, I would say, 3 or 4 major elements. One is the major exhibits. So these are designers that get paired with landscape companies, and the designers can be from all over the world. Mm-hmm. And we really also with major exhibits have been really working to diversify the pool. So we have diverse designers, and that's kind of divided into 2 groups. It's kind of major landscapes and then floral designs, which are a significant part of that as well. And then the part that I think most people might maybe love the most is called the Horticourt. And that's kind of like almost like a county fair where people bring individual plants that are in different classes to be judged against each other. Oh, yeah. So for example, cactus and succulents are really big. So there'll be an entire class just on gasterias or entire class on echeverias. So there's about 200 classes. Over the course of the show, there's 5,000 entries. Wow. And it's extremely competitive. However, we encourage anybody to bring a plant and put it into the competition. And then each class is judged by a panel of judges. And then kind of outside of that, we have some educational exhibits. So that might be high schools or colleges, and then or plant societies that have displays. They're smaller than the major exhibits. And then there's a kind of like Chelsea and Hampton Court, there's a massive kind of marketplace area where there's hundreds of vendors of plants and related, tools, and some non-plant items too, but still kind of in the horticultural realm. The show runs from March 4th to the 12th. If you have any visitors coming from the US or from foreign countries, you can find out all the information at phsonline.org. Tickets are available now. And it's indoors. So it's at the Pennsylvania Convention Center. It's a completely indoor show. Actually, the last 2 years, for the first time in the almost 200-year history, the show was outdoors because of COVID. So we really had to pivot and do an outdoor show for 2 years in a row, which was very, very different than an
Yeah.
indoor show. So I think people are excited to be back in the convention center, because for Philadelphians and in that region, it really is like the beginning of spring. It's a tradition, I think, multi-generational, to go to the Philadelphia Flower Show. So, and we get a lot of people that come down take the train down from New York City or take the train up from Washington, D.C. We get hundreds of bus tours, like they're just constantly coming. Like I went to Keukenhof one year in the Netherlands, and I think they said on a busy day, they get actually hundreds of buses in a day. We don't get that much in a day, but it is a steady stream.
Well, and number of visitors over the course of the 4 days, or?
Yeah, it could be between 200,000 and 250,000.
Wow.
It's a lot of people every day, kind of shoulder to shoulder. The best way to see the flower show is become a member, and you can go to Members Day, which is less people, or you can sign up for an early morning tour, which gets you kind of access before the show even opens, and kind of a behind the scenes look at the flower show. So there are ways to see the show and not be amongst so many people.
Yeah, very nice. I'll put the link in the show notes anyway. Just on trends then, so I think there was one that I didn't cover, which was the last one on your list, and it was the growing trend towards grow your own or growing your own food. What are you guys seeing there?
Right. So the Hort Society, that's been kind of one of our foundational pieces for many decades, is the promotion of growing your own food. So we partner with 170 local community gardens who grow food for themselves, but also contribute to local food kitchens and food banks. So for us, it's always been, a significant part of the work that we do. But again, with the pandemic and people maybe not wanting to venture out to a market or grocery store, there was an incredible uptick in interest in growing your own food, whether it was just, somebody with a big pot on their patio growing a tomato and some peppers or lettuce or whatever the case might be, or people sharing garden spaces like a local community garden. And that was a major uptick during COVID. And I've spoken with to George Ball, who owns Burpee Seed Company, and he said that trend is not waning at all. So there's continues to be a great interest in it, and there's and it's also reflected in the hybridizing work. So again, in these trade shows, you'll see there was always an emphasis on vegetables and stuff, but now there's an emphasis on there's a company, Plant Nouveau, which is a kind of a promotional company for new brands, and they have some fastigiate apples for kind of small space gardens, or blueberries that you can grow on the patio, or there's actually Ball Horticulture Company, which is probably the biggest breeding company in the United States. They have these little tomatoes that they grow that you can actually grow on your windowsill, and they'll produce tomatoes. They're little tomatoes, but the idea is that even a city dweller can grow vegetables, on their windowsill. Wow. And just like in Philadelphia, we have a nonprofit called POP, Philadelphia Orchard Project, and what they do is they encourage the planting of orchard trees, apples and pears and peaches, in just like minimal space. So I would say that's just continues to grow, and I kind of like the house plant, and also the kind of ecological gardening, I think all those are, they're not going to be waning anytime soon. I see those as being trends for, for many years to come, because many of them are so broad in their scope that there's opportunities for expansion on many different levels.
Yeah, and I suppose, yeah, like, and broader concerns are probably driving them to a certain extent on the food side. There's food quality has been talked about quite a lot, not so much in Ireland or in the States. Food security has been talked about a bit, and certainly an emphasis on having quality, homegrown, organic type food is a trend that we're seeing here. And then on the on the side of the ecological gardening, there is obviously the concerns around habitat loss and biodiversity loss and things like that. So yeah, they're probably more than a trend at this stage. They're going to be ingrained, I think, for a long time. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and even introducing pollinator plants into vegetable gardens, like that's I would say a trend as well. Maybe creating like a border around the vegetable garden that really encourages pollinators to come in. Yeah, and I think people, post-pandemic or during the pandemic, we're working from home, and a lot of people, are in office situations where they haven't really gone back fully to work, so they're just home more. So if you're working from home, you can just easily take a 5-minute break and go out and do some gardening. So I think that's completely fueled the overall gardening itself is continues to trend up, which is great. And I think that, again, that's fueled by people just knowing that they can do their work at home.
Yeah, for sure. Final question, prompted by the fact that you travel to around Europe and in the US to these plant shows and international garden shows. Buxus blight has been a big issue on this side of the Atlantic over the last few years, and I've seen recently some blight-free varieties that have been introduced, and there's a bit of excitement around them. Although they seem to, in what I've seen of them so far, they seem to not be as tidy looking as the traditional sempervirens. But have you come across them, or what's your thoughts on them?
Yeah, I've seen those also at trade shows. It may be kind of too soon to tell. Like when I worked at the Chicago Botanic Garden, we had they have a lot of boxwoods because it's fairly hardy plant, and we had very strict protocols on new plants coming in the garden and so forth to kind of mitigate against boxwood blight. Out here, there's less. I mean, there's still a lot of boxwoods, but I think not that the disease is waning, but maybe because there's so many other diseases and insect problems that it's not as big as news as it was five years ago. But it is great that there is breeding work being done on boxwoods, because there are species that are native to places like the Republic of Georgia and so forth, that where they're native, that there could be genetics that exhibit a resistance to boxwood blight. So I think we'll see more cultivars come on the market. We've also been I've seen nurseries promoting other plants as replacement for boxwood. So like we have a native holly called the inkberry holly, Ilex glabra, and there's some real congested forms of that are being promoted. Or I was at Het Loo in the Netherlands, and they have it's a very formal garden. I believe all the edging is now the Japanese holly, Ilex crenata. So
crenata,
yeah, there are they're not exactly the same. And if you're a diehard boxwood fan, only boxwood will do, I'm sure. But between other species and some of these newer cultivars, I think we'll probably come out of the boxwood blight era with some bona fide resistant plants, and maybe more diversity of genetics,
Yeah.
which will also hedge against things like boxwood blight. I mean, that's where we get into problems, is creating these monocultures, and then a disease or an insect comes in and just wipes them out. We had this same issue with with our elms, with Dutch elm disease. Same elms planted every single neighborhood, and then the Dutch elm disease came in and killed them all.
Okay, and that prompts the question: is there any elms left in the US now? Or
yeah, they're around. Even in Swarthmore, there's some beautiful old specimens, and people be like, "Oh God, that must be resistant to Dutch elm disease," and it's probably not. It's just been in isolation, so that for whatever reason, the Dutch elm disease has not attacked them. There's some beautiful ones up at the Arboretum, and they do inject them with something to prevent the Dutch elm disease. But yeah, you see them around here and there, and if they're like any plant, if they're really healthy, they're less
susceptible,
likely to get the disease or insect problems. It's usually ones that are stressed or in decline that the disease kind of comes in and finishes them off.
Yeah, for sure. We've talked about quite a few topics. Some of them, as I said, as I thought we might, had nothing to do with what we were going to center the episode on. But it's been a really interesting chat. Lots of interesting topics, and yeah, it's been interesting to see the trends are quite similar with a few little minor differences in it. So, Andrew, thank you very, very much for coming on Master My Garden podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and I like a conversation that's fluid. So I'm glad we were able to touch on some other subjects other than trends.
Yeah, for sure. So that's been this week's episode. A huge thanks to Andrew for coming on. As I say, it's always interesting to to go to a different part of the world and hear what trends are happening. Are the challenges the same? Are the all of that sort of thing? It's always interesting, and yeah, there is. I think there's a lot that is similar with obviously a few differences. So yeah, a great chat. Really interesting. I'll put the links in the show notes to the show and to the website and all that, so you'll be able to find out more about those things. And yeah, that's been this week's episode. Thanks for listening, and until the next time, happy gardening.